Hey, this is Cap, and you're watching Thorin, the only man besides Richard Lewis who somehow found a way to get both League of Legends and Dota Redditors to hate him.
This is another of my Patreon AMA videos where each month people who donate $10 or more as part of their support for my Patreon can ask me a question, and assuming it's relevant, appropriate, not a question that I've been asked a million times before, it might well be answered in this particular feature as is going to now. Now, I have been behind on some of these for reasons that we won't bother going into right now, but I'm going to catch up. I have a plan in mind where basically I'll double, triple up on some of the months, and I even have an approach in mind where, because I can look up in the back end all the patrons past and present, I will contact some of the people who were past patrons for the months I missed, and you can potentially still get the chance to ask a question. So if you're someone who is watching this now, but you're not a patron anymore, great. Thanks for the support at the time. I'll be reaching out to you via a message on the Patreon site. So we'll start off with Wendelful. And he says, do you think that with TL, Team Liquid, being able to pick up a foreign top laner once Jensen receives native LCS status, they should look to acquire a carry-minded player and shift to mid-top focus, using Doublelift more like Jackie Love on Invictus Gaming, IG, or is his style too predicated on being a focal point for this to work? Right, so there's three factors at play here. One is that Team Liquid can have the same team but just replace Impact with an import player, because Impact himself is not actually an import player right now. He's an NA resident. And on the basis of when Jensen becomes an NA resident, then there's the angle of like, should they replace him with a carry top player? And then there's also the aspect though of, if you do that, you know, what's the impact on Doublelift there? So what I would say is this. First of all, as far as I know, Jensen's NA residence actually begins this split. It has already happened, basically. So they could already have a top lane. Now, obviously, they weren't going to have to win in the LCS and come in second at MSI, change players. As I think it's pretty unlikely to change players anyway. I think it would be at the end of the year. So presumably, after this split, after Worlds, at the end of this year, going into Season 10, is when they'd be most viable to make that change. And so, will they, should they? Because remember, Jensen joined the league, I mean, it would have been in 2015, Season 5's summer split. So it's now been 4 years. He's got all the paperwork, etc., and he isn't an import anymore. So at the moment, the only import players that they have on Team Liquid, well, there's only one. It's called JJ. So in theory, yes, they can recruit another import player. In terms of should they, right, first of all, we'll look just on the impact side of things. While I was a little surprised with some of Impact's games at MSI. I thought some games he was just all right. I thought certainly his just having basic competency on a different champion pool than what he played in LCS and more traditionally was impressive. I thought he did his job fine. I certainly didn't think he was one of the best players. I thought people like Reaper, etc., overrated him because they're mates with him during the group stage part. I certainly do think he performed well against IG, but I also thought, bizarrely, the Shy was both a little bit quiet, and I felt they kind of just left him on an island a little bit. So I'm certainly not someone who's going to overrate Impact. With that said, I do kind of agree with the logic that Steve Arneset, the owner of Team Liquid, actually said, which is that like a player like him who can essentially absorb pressure and doesn't have to be a carry threat is very valuable. Like, I do kind of think in most teams, with the exception of amazing super teams, that you probably need at least one player like that. And in fact, I'll even go out on a limb and say I think that actually having one player like that and then godlike carries in the other lanes is probably the best approach. Like, if you look at the teams that I think had the consistency and either were the best ever or could have been the best ever, I think you go and you look at the SK Telecom that had impact on it. And guess what? He was the player that was the player who absorbs pressure and doesn't necessarily play all the carries. Then you look at the fact that you went to the lineup in Season 5 when they had Marin. And part of what allowed Marin to play so aggressively in the top lane and have all that jungle attention was that Bang, as a player, is, thanks actually to his role as well, not going to be a guy who's going to try and go super ham the whole game through unless he gets to the team fights. So at lane, I always thought was basically like a poor man's version of what we later saw with the Prey and Gorilla bot lane, so same time period actually. I thought they were just a better version of what Bang and Wolf brought to the table, so I think you had one there. I think if you go and look at the RNG team, that last year, the only tournament they didn't win was Worlds, and they were poised to be one of the greatest teams of all time, and they already are, to be honest. I think you look at Let Me. This is a guy who was doing a very good job absorbing pressure top. He can sometimes play carries if you see him in the LPL, but he was an amazing player at absorbing pressure. He's one of the only people who could deal with Prime the Shy going fucking ham. So that allowed that team to be a Xiaohu and obviously massively Uzi I-based team. So it gave them a lot of power in that respect. And sometimes you could flex off and do something else in terms of which players carried. Most times you played through the lanes that made sense. I think if you look at the teams that in theory are trying to be super teams, SK Telecom now, you go and look at G2 now, you look at IG now, I think they have more flaws in the fact that they don't have someone who's just a good absorb pressure type player, even though at the moment the meta allows them in theory to play through any lanes, and let's be real, they're mainly just playing through the solos still. So, except for SK Telecom. So I personally think you probably just get a more consistent team if you do that, because the problem is what happens to the carry player when he is the one who gets the least resources of the three, and what happens when he's having a bad game, and what happens when he's camped. Now, there are plenty of good carry players who can manage that, but not in the same way as I think some of the absorb pressure type non-carry threats. So I do think generally having one of those players is good. The problem Team Liquid has at the moment is, the game is massively based around the solo lanes. And if you want to accelerate the game, that was already the way you played anyway. And then thirdly, the killer fact for me is that it doesn't look right now as though Riot's necessarily going to switch the game so that the meta goes back towards bot lane anytime soon. So I will say, at the moment, it's not the ideal time necessarily to have that be your top lane. Obviously, through most of the rest of history, that was the best position to have, be the absorb pressure, non-carry. Hence why my favourite player, Flame, wasn't in the best teams in the world. It wasn't that he wasn't a great carry player. Of course he was. It's that you usually didn't want a great carry player unless your whole team was set up that way, as indeed some of the Rocks teams were. So I think personally, I don't have a problem with Impact staying. I think for me, in Team Liquid, I didn't think Impact was the issue. For me, it was more that Jensen, until you got to the international level, wasn't playing like the superstar player he can play like. He didn't play like that in LCS. I think if he had, Team Liquid would have won the league much more convincingly, could have had a perfect season, in fact, could literally have 3-0'd everyone and could have won every game. Now, he didn't do that, so they didn't do those things. And I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure if he was tentative in his first split, if he hadn't fully gotten comfortable with other people. I will say Jensen is a player I do think orients around comfort, even when he was at his best in Cloud9, and the team had to be set up for him. So this is obviously more of a double-lift team. I think that's the bigger issue to me. In terms of can they, should they? Yeah, I think there are players out there you could do it with, but I personally would be a little bit cleverer. What I would do is I would pick a player who also fits the bill of Impact, but in my opinion is a better Impact right now. So I'd pick someone who also generally embraces a low econ mindset, embraces being an absorb pressure top, but has shown either more potential for carries or is actually legitimately really good on carries. So I would say two obvious candidates for that, assuming we're going to go with European players, because I personally think important really good European talent right now makes more sense because of the English communication than important Koreans, especially because in the current meta, not that massive a difference between good Koreans and good Europeans. So I think the most obvious example to me would be if I'm Team Liquid, I go spend a lot of that money and I tell Cabashard, come on and play at Team Liquid, mate, because first of all, he's an amazing low econ top in the more recent years, which is crazy because that was not the player he was when he first popped up in that original Gambit in the first Vitality squad. He was the guy who had to be the carry and had to have the game based around him, had to have all the ganks go top. Now you've seen he can carry top. He's still a really good player in that sense, but he can also play low econ if he wants to. He can allow you to play away from him. You can put all your focus mid if you want, as they sometimes do in Vitality. That works. So I think Cabashad would be an amazing addition and would give them a full triple threat setup. But naturally, you would go towards mid and AD, and actually it would allow Jensen on games where it's not going for him to himself just be more of a passive player in the mid, just farm under his tower, and then let the top sometimes carry the game. I think that would be the killer for me and would make Team Liquid the kind of squad that on paper Cloud9 is. So I think that would be a great addition. A little bit more of a risk, but I'd consider Odoam there. He's had so many years as a great low econ top player. I will say some of his carry games beyond Season 6 Worlds sometimes left something to be, desired. I didn't think in Splice it was that great. I think if you look at him now in the Schalke team, I mean, he's still a very good player, but some of the carry games are the ones that go wonky. Then again, I haven't been that convinced overall with the setup of some of the teams he's on. So I think this would be a much better team. And I think if you give him someone like Xmithy, fucking hell, they're going to love playing with each other. So I think those two would be great additions. I'll also say, I certainly don't think you have to move away from playing through your AD carry if your AD carry is your best player. I would say this. Look at the end of the last split where the meta, we'd had a full chance to play through it all, to see some of the other options, right? So let's look at some of the teams that were at the top in different regions and ask who their best player is. So Team Liquid, they were the best NA team. Doublelift was their best player. You had SK Telecom ended up winning LCK and for most of the split being the second best team overall anyway. Teddy, I would argue, is probably their best player at that point in time. Faker certainly up there. You go and you see the Kingzone team that made a late run, made it all the way through the playoffs, end up finishing third, even gave SKT some good games, or close games rather, they weren't really that good. Deft was, in my opinion, the best AD carry. I actually think he was better than Teddy over that split. So Deft was doing really well. In fact, their whole bot lane was the main lane that they played through and had the strength from in that team. Over in China, I know because RNG got knocked out early and RNG did not make the deep run, people forget, most experts I know, while the regular split was going on, didn't think IG was the best team. They all thought RNG were, and that RNG was still going to tick over and become monsters in the playoffs. Well, RNG, it's an Uzi I team, right? Amazing J was doing what he could in the top lane, but he was a bit of a wonky player by the time it came out. Then you go and look in Europe. So you had Origin was one of the best teams, obviously. Patrick, definitely one of their better players. Pretty skilled AD carry, right? And who was the best AD carry in Europe over the split? I think it wouldn't be unfair to say Reckless overall, if you look at some of the games he had to carry. And his Fnatic team not only went on a great streak towards the end of the split, finished third. And you know what? Before they played Origin, where yes, I picked Origin and Origin won, certainly there was a world in which they could have beaten Origin. So I think you look at all these regions, if you still have the best AD carry or one of the best, it still makes sense to play through them. It still makes sense to give them resources. You might not be as fantastically successful as if it was like the fucking Ardent Sensor meta or something, but I think it'll still work very, very well for you. So I don't think you should necessarily move away from that. So if you've got Doublelift, first of all, you should play through them when it's possible. You should get your edges where you can in that sense. I personally thought even during the tank top meta, if you saw the way Flame played on the bruisers, like Shyvana, like Renekton, the guy could absolutely still carry the game. And if that was the point, was you had Emperor, who's just a good AD carry, do you want to put the resources through to him? I think personally, global meta thinking like that's a bit flawed. I agree with global meta thinking and the way you're doing it, in terms of you want to set up as a GM, how do I recruit players? How am I setting up the team? So I think generally in most Doublelift teams, people should play through him. He's got a good mentality for how to play the game, how to carry the game. He accepts the responsibility. In that sense, he is a leader in the game. I can respect a lot of that stuff. I also think generally, it's not that he can't play another start. It's just that I don't think he would enjoy it as much. I don't think he would be as comfortable. I don't think it would make as much sense overall. So personally, I just wouldn't play away from him. You definitely could though, as you say in it. The way that Jackie Love plays on IG, where you still play up, you still play as a lane that's being played around, but they just don't give you as much jungle attention and play through you. I think that could obviously work as well and make Doublelift an incredibly devastating player if you had a Jensen, Odoamne, or Kabashad going ham in the other lanes, and then you have a super good bot lane that can direct itself, be self-sufficient, and play up and potentially win lane. I think, yes, that would be an incredibly devastating lineup. And I think Doublelift, crucially, this is it. If he really bought into Kabashad or Odoamne and respected them as players, I think he would let that happen enough in metas where it wasn't all about bot lane. And obviously, you still want Doublelift. Let's have it when it comes to strong team fight meta or strong bot lane meta. Of course, you want Doublelift in your team then. So I would just say that, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Soliko says, hey Thorin, I would love for you to talk about ethical dilemmas in esports journalism, or give an example to an ethical dilemma you dealt with and how it affected you professionally and personally. Right, I'm not going to talk about how it affected me personally. First of all, I don't really get personally affected in that particular way by things in my job. And then secondly, none of your business what I thought personally. So what I would say is this. There are plenty of ethical dilemmas available. A key distinction to make. People often confuse, or think they're synonyms, the words ethics and morals. Like, the division for me is this. Ethics is like the standards set, and hopefully you uphold, within your profession, your job, in some like official capacity. Morals are your own personal morality. What you think is right and wrong, what you think should and shouldn't be done, how you think you should live your life, and others should live their life. Like, that's morality. So there is a key distinction there, because, for example, there are things that are unethical that aren't necessarily immoral. I mean, some of them are about like you made a promise or like you owe something to someone. Some of them are just rules that we arbitrarily have set, but they tend to make the job less scummy, make it more reasonable, make it so people can trust you. There's aspects of that. Likewise, it can go the other way. Things could be immoral, but not necessarily considered unethical. I mean, an obvious example of that, lying. There are certain contexts in which journalists, it seems, are allowed to lie. I personally consider that immoral. I don't do it. I don't lie publicly. As I've said many, many times, you cannot find a single statement I've ever said in my entire career, with the exception of jokes, that is a lie. That is not true. That's simply something that's never happened. So, in light of that, there have been many, many times where there are ethical dilemmas. It's just, luckily, I've been in the game long enough and I've read enough along these lines and I've thought about these things enough that I know where I come down on it. I know what my standards are. I know what line I want to toe, as it were, and I know where how to deal with each dilemma. So I'll give you an obvious example. Even though I'm not the sort of journalist who generally does investigative journalism, I do in a way, because I obviously investigate and I obviously take information and then use that to inform either my opinions or my commentary on the industry. And occasionally I'll do videos where I've used investigative journalism in the traditional sense. So I will say there are people who come to me who want me to know certain things and perhaps hope I will repeat certain things and publicize certain things. And the problem is they come to me with a juicy piece of info, something that might be happening, something that would be cool if it happens. And what happens is you're not supposed to, as a journalist, just go on one source like that with no other info, unless it was some life or death, like a really important thing that could, like incredibly important, and you really knew this person was telling the truth. So under normal circumstances, you're supposed to corroborate it. You're supposed to look for another source that's independent of this source, that won't have talked to them, that can tell you the same information, either unprompted, that's the best, or you can say, what do you know about this? And then they might say, well, this such and such is happening. And then as a result, you're able to corroborate the information. So in scenarios like that, where it was a really juicy piece of info, really interesting piece of info, really cool piece of info that I'd like to be true, if I can't find anyone to corroborate it, well, now I'm at risk of being used as a pawn in a political chess game by the individual who's fed me the info. And you know what? Maybe they say they're my friend, maybe they say that it's true what they're doing, etc. But I don't know the grander game, so I'm not going to be a pawn in that game. I'm not going to be someone else's bagman. And so as a result, when that happens, I am forced to ignore the information and to bury the story. I cannot do anything with it. Like, they're welcome to go to someone else and try and get the story through them, but they won't be getting it through me. Similarly, I think an obvious scenario would be when some of the information I have to report upon or something I might have to expose is regarding a company I work for, could be a site I write for, could be an event organizer that hires me to work their events, could be an event organizer that's hired me to create content with them, all sorts of factors. In those scenarios, right, it's just a situation that you're not going to be able to work for those companies if you expose certain information about them or certain wrongdoing that they've done. So here's the ethical dilemma, right? Is that as a journalist, remember, when I work with them, sometimes I'm not a journalist if I'm working on an event as an analyst, for example. But the journalist, Thorin, has this story which seems to have some relevance to it, and it's an important story, and it should get out there somehow. So what do I do when I'm in that scenario? Well, it's quite simple. I'm not the only journalist in the scene. What I do is I will take the information I have. I will maybe even speak to some of the sources and tell them, listen, I have to recuse myself from this situation. I'm actually involved with the party we're talking about right now. So even though I certainly would investigate this, I trust that this information can be verified and would turn out to be a real story, but can we pass it along to someone else, or will you go to another journalist? And what I basically do is I make sure one of the other journalists in the scene gets that information and they don't have a connection, and then they're free to publish the story. They're free to out that information. And so I have helped many, many journalists receive stories. Obviously, colleague and friend of mine, Richard Lewis, I've passed him many, many stories over the years that it just didn't make sense for me to be the one to do, but he didn't work with that company, he didn't work with that person, and he could out it, and no problem whatsoever. It was a real story. It needed to get out there. Now, some of the companies I work with might not like that, but that's their own problem. If they want to hire Thorin the analyst, they have to know that Thorin the journalist exists as well and has his own separate set of standards and ways that he has to behave in that sense. So it's an obvious one. I'll give you a few more before we go. You can run through some of the most obvious ones. I think an obvious one to me that in esports is an often ethical dilemma, and this is a thing that's going to tempt a lot of the rookie journalists, so if you can't handle this, get the fuck out of our industry, is you have a story that you report upon, and you do have the sources for the story, and you maybe even have evidence for the story, and you know that this story is either 100% true, or it's as close to true as anyone can find, and that is the most reasonable outcome right now. And someone involved in the story, that's when it's most significant, not when it's just some random, someone involved in the story understands that an ethical concern of a journalist is you must protect your sources. You cannot out who the source is, because that can endanger them publicly, can endanger them professionally, can endanger their private relationships. And they have told you this information saying, I do not want to go on record. I want to remain anonymous. So you must make the number one priority your protection of that person's anonymity, essentially keeping your word that they will remain anonymous as a source. But in this scenario where someone calls you out, oh, he's lying, he's making up the story, like that player isn't joining, that player didn't say such and such. In our team, we didn't agree to that. Now, you could, as a journalist, say, you're full of shit. Your teammate's the one who told me this, actually. Or, you know what? You yourself even gave me a piece of information once, which when I added to another piece of information shows that that's correct. Or, you know what? You say your team isn't doing it, but actually two of your other teammates both privately came to me and were very concerned that you were the only person who wanted to do this thing overall. Like, in that scenario, I can wreck that guy instantly. He'll lose the PR battle immediately. I'll show that I'm right. He'll be proven wrong and a liar. Him calling me a liar will be invalidated. And in fact, now people won't trust him. Or I have to just sit on it and say, I have the sources. I can't reveal who they are. You're going to have to trust me, my reputation, my integrity, the fact that I haven't lied for 18 years publicly in any context whatsoever. You have to just swallow that. And you know what? Some people aren't going to believe you. And some people are going to say, well, unless you show me, I'll never believe it. If you had the source, you'd show it, etc. Some people don't understand journalism that way, but that is their failing, not mine. And so as a professional, I will never reveal that information. And that sometimes does mean that there have been egregious cases. Like I've had ones where I've been called out by someone where it was their teammate. I've even had certain scenarios where someone's called me out and they, on some level, were involved with the information I'd gathered about the story, which is definitely true, but I couldn't call out the other people I protected there. I think the last one I'd probably say would be, and this is just my own personal ethical standard, and a lot of other journalists don't believe in this, but personally, I don't like people being pressured into doing interviews. I don't like people feeling like they're obliged to do interviews. In my opinion, when someone agrees to do an interview with me, it's a collaborative work project between me and them to hopefully provide a good interview that's interesting, has lots of great info in it, maybe challenges them a little bit, but gives them a chance to give their side. And under those circumstances, since it's a collaborative effort, I believe you should behave with a certain level of fair play and a certain aspect of teamwork in that sense. It's not that they're just giving something to me or I'm taking something. So as a result, personally, if I ask someone to do an interview and they say, no, thank you, I'm not interested, I personally consider it, this is only my own opinion, not the right thing to do for a journalist to then later say, oh, don't ever expect an interview from person X, he just doesn't do interviews with me, or person Y, he just doesn't do interviews with me. Generally, I have almost, this is not like a strict ethical standard, but I personally don't think you should do that as a journalist. I think that's kind of abusing your position, and then you are putting pressure upon that person from their fans or from the public, that like it changes their rep as to who they are in terms of media, or people asking, why won't you do interviews with this person? So the only time generally that I have called those people out is when they did agree to do an interview with me and then changed their mind later. So famously, Meteos getting butthurt over a tweet I made about St. Vicious, so he changed his mind and wouldn't do an interview. And then, crucially, even then I wasn't going to reveal that, but then he'd also said he would personally go and talk to his teammates and make sure they wouldn't do an interview. Well, guess what? In that scenario, now I will call you out because you have actively been malicious and in a way where you've gone out of your way to damage me. So that's the news that I think now is of public interest. Similarly, when I did some interviews famously with some CLG players and they wanted to literally spike the whole interview or edit half of it out. Well, again, I've done the interview already. Within reason, I would edit it, but you're being malicious now. Then I was willing to out those things. Similarly, if people just don't turn up to a bunch of interviews, I then, in certain cases, wouldn't have an issue if that person was being douchey, calling them out that publicly they didn't turn up to the interviews. Under normal circumstances, though, if you just ask them and they say no, I think you should keep that private personally. I think generally you shouldn't reveal it. There've only been a couple of cases in which I revealed it, and that was mainly because I knew the other person publicly had said they wouldn't do interviews, and therefore it was safe to do so. Barbara Stanwyck's Legs says, who was the third best Painkiller during the World Tour? So this was the 2005 CPL Painkiller World Tour, where they went to 9 stops and then a grand final in New York. And right, the obvious assumption here, the reason why he's asking who the third best Painkiller player is the number one and number two are obvious. It's Vu and Fatality. Vu won the most prize money and the most stops. Fatality won the second most stops, including the grand final, and won a lot of prize money himself. So you can decide what order you want them in. I'd probably put Vu first, Fatality second, but I wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world if someone had some logic as to why Fatality was second. I would say the stats don't really support that, but he did win the grand final. The thing is, the third place one's a lot tougher because actually there's three candidates, and in my opinion, it's only really between two of them overall. The three candidates most obviously are ZYZ, or ZYZ as an English person would say, but he's German, the German former Quake 3 player. You had Strider from Sweden, and you had Sturmy from Italy. And the reasons why go like this. ZYZ had, aside from Fatality and Vu, the best average overall placing. He had an amazing set of runs. Now, interestingly, he never made a final. He never won a stop. But that's one of the factors about Painkiller that was very weird, actually. Generally, it was a very consistent game. That's why Vu and Fatality were like almost all the finals. Vu was winning most of them. Fatality was coming second. Like, that's because of the fact it was so consistent a game. So ZYZ showed that. He finished third and fourth pretty much all the time. He finished a top 4 in 8 out of the 10 stops, one of them including the finals. He had a whole bunch of third places. Like, what a great performance overall. So I probably would pick him. I wouldn't mind if you want to use different criteria. Someone's saying Strider, though, because Strider outright won a stop, which ZYZ didn't, but he also finished third place twice, fourth place twice. So he had a very nice run of form, less overall top placing than ZYZ, but he won a stop. So if you want to argue that angle, that because you won a stop, that's also something that would make you one of the best players or better player. Yeah, I think his potential was better. I think he was overall a better player at Painkiller because he was just a fantastically talented esports player in general and tournament player, as you saw that in Quake 4. This guy was just a stud. The last person is Sturmy, who had like 3 third places, and one of them was at the finals. So listen, top placing at the finals, a big deal, right? Problem with him is he didn't win a stop and he didn't have as many top 4s and 3rds and 4ths overall as ZYZ. So I think it's between ZYZ on consistency or Strider in terms of what he was able to do at his peak and his best performances. So I personally would probably go with ZYZ on that one overall. I think consistency does win out in that sense. Although I think it's a tough one. I think it's kind of, you have to chop up the criteria a little bit there. A Crunchy Captain says, as someone who is considered pretty divisive, you've been the target of harassment from many different communities. Has there ever been a point over the years where the harassment has been almost too much for you? Right, so first of all, the problem with the term harassment is, in terms of what your normal life is like, you're just walking around, you say something to a small group of people, you do an action that just only has a ripple in your tiny little community, your workplace, your friend group. All online communication for people like me is basically harassment, because if you were in a small group of friends and 10 people were all saying, hey, you piece of shit, fuck you, shut up, get out of here, you'd consider that harassment. If you were in your workplace and people passed by your desk all day long going, you fucking hack, oh, you just do this for the money, don't you, piece of shit, wow, fuck you, you should be banned, that would be considered harassment, right? Well, that basically is what happens to me on most tweets that I make, most pieces of content that I make, there's people engaging in that kind of behavior. It's just that personally, I don't really think that that's that much harassment. Like, obviously, it's not as bad to have that happen on the internet as it is in person, so it's not as extreme. I think harassment is probably a little bit over-egging the pudding on how to characterize that. I'd say it's just mildly annoying, a little bit, sometimes a little bit upsetting, can be demoralizing on some level. Yeah, sure, these factors, certainly. But I also think, personally, you probably shouldn't do this kind of job if you're just a normal person. Like, you won't be able to handle it. Like, the whole point about me is, I'm someone where long before I ever came on camera and ever told anyone my opinions, already was absolutely fine with everyone in a room thinking I'm an idiot, thinking I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, thinking I'm arrogant, disliking me, thinking I'm obnoxious, not wanting to be around me. That was already something I was comfortable with. Just life in general, right? I'm an unusual kind of guy. I'm not the sort of person who goes along with the crowd. I'm not the sort of person who will hide what he thinks if he knows people will get upset by it or annoyed or find it obnoxious. I will say, generally, it's a little bit annoying that I'm not making these comments to specific people, and yet they go out of their way to comment to me, but I generally try to ignore that. If I do, I just let it go off my back, water off a duck's back, all that sort of shit. I wouldn't ever say it really got too much for me ever. I mean, even that whole scenario when I was in Poland and every fucking Polish person seemingly was flaming me online, saying I should die, they were going to rape me and kill me, what hotel was I at? Even in that moment, I wasn't really thinking like, wow, I can never go on, or this is going to scar me for life. What I was thinking was, first of all, fuck all these people. What absolute hypocrites they all are, what lack of self-awareness they have. And then thirdly, there's a real story. I was sat there thinking, right now, most people's career's over in this regard. They can't be on camera again. They definitely won't do Counter-Strike again. They'll never get invited to a big event in Poland, that's for sure. And I thought, I'm going to be the one who does. I'm going to be the one who gets that invite. And I did. Got an invite to a number of majors after that were held in Poland. I was going to be the one who become the number one analyst in CSGO in spite of all that stuff. I was going to be the one who some of those people would change their mind later and probably say, now I like you and think you are good, even though it's like, oh, great, you were the idiot before then, weren't you? Like, that's not exactly a reasonable position when you said you actually killed myself before. So generally, I just have a mind that's a little bit sturdier in that sense. Now, I wouldn't recommend that to anyone else. It's a hard way to live. I don't necessarily know that other people would enjoy that life, but I can generally handle it. I do think it does get too much for normal people, though. I think most people can't handle it. I think that's why you see most people, even people who don't seem to get as much harassment or criticism as I do, wig out all the time online, lose their shit, make like ridiculously emotional appeals, or even worse, just compliment fish from their own fan base all day long to make themselves feel better. I do think that certainly it's too much data, it's too much information, it's too many opinions for most people to handle. But I think overall I can handle it. Like I'm made of certain stuff than that. They won't get to me, boys. Daniel Olivar says, how instrumental was Magisk? Oh, by the way, as a quick aside as well, I don't think overall I'm as divisive as people make out. I think that's massively overblown. I think just having an opinion that goes against the consensus is considered divisive in the modern day. And quite frankly, I think more people should have an opinion that goes against the consensus if that's what they actually think. Daniel Olivar says, how instrumental was Magisk to the rise of Astralis? Was he the missing piece, or was the team already on a rise and could have hit similar heights with a different player? Right. The interesting thing is, I actually do think there's a world in which they could have also still been the number one team with a different player, and that player, for obvious reasons, would be Config, because I think Config was a better version of what Kirby was. I think also he had even though he had some aspects to his mentality that were quite poor and some aspects to even practice, work ethic, etc., that weren't what I would like them to be. I think if he'd been on a team like this and they'd been winning, I think they could have collectively influenced him the right way, and I think they could have been an incredible, very, very aggressive attacking team with monster T-sides if they'd have had him and Dupree in the same team. I think that could have been a team the likes of which we've never seen before. That level of T-side aggression and ability to just storm over people. I think you'd have to compare it to the great French teams, to the LDLC envious type teams, if you want to find someone even vaguely comparable. So I think that team would have been amazing. I believe that even was a player that they were looking at before Magisk. I think Magisk obviously did turn out to be exceptionally good for them. First of all, he's such a monster anchor type player on CT side who can just hold a position. So you saw their CT sides got incredible on Astralis. On the T side, it 100% freed up Dupree to be the entry role. Magisk is fantastic even in what he does, although I don't think he's as necessary on the T side at times. I think he works well with the other players though. Crucially, as I said with the config angle, I think it was at the part we couldn't have known was how the others would influence Magisk and keep him in line and improve his mentality. Because he was a guy himself where when he was in Optic and North, he had his issues. He had his behavioural problems. He didn't always eventually want to do what people said or work along with them in exactly the same way. Maybe he had frustrations, etc. So that's the key thing. I do think if they'd have stayed with Kirby, that they wouldn't have been the number one team. I think with how open the year was, they could have won some tournaments. But I think actually that, like, I mean, for example, I think FaZe and Navi would probably have been the best team. I think FaZe, Navi and Team Liquid would split up most of the titles, basically. I think, obviously, FaZe wouldn't have had many more because Olaf went out around the time Astralis got really good. But I think if you look at it, first of all, Navi, I think, would have won... I mean, they would have won a major at least, I think. I think they would have won at least one or two more titles. I think Team Liquid could literally have won 3 or 4 more titles. I know they had the whole choking thing, but I think that would have been resolved a lot quicker if they'd have played a lot more finals against FaZes and Navis. Obviously, Navi was the team famously they actually had the number of. So I think Team Liquid would have won a lot more titles. I don't think Astralis would have been overall the number one team. So in a way, he was the missing piece, but he wasn't the missing piece as in this is what's missing and he filled it. He actually brought things that we didn't even know could have been missing and made them a different type of team. And that's, for me, the key is then the balance across the board in the team was really, really nice because you had Glaive and Dupree wanting to be more aggressive, playmaking in that respect. You had Device not just passive, but now opened up to being just more mobile, and that was a way to make him be allowed to be passive at times, and then on other times to take a scenario that made sense for him. And then you had someone like Magisk, who obviously is a little bit more on the defensive side, and then you have Xyp9x, who just plays his role and wins the clutch. So I think the balance of the team is what ended up being crazy, and then no one could have predicted, Glaive's fragging, etc., Xyp9x's performance at some of the tournaments. Like, I think they also had, it was a perfect storm of all the things coming together. And that's why it's so cool that they didn't pick that lineup, but it ended up being the best to play Counter-Strike ever. So next is Aerobax, and he says, I was surprised to find out you followed battle rap. Are there any other interests you have that would surprise people? Right? I think people, this is a weird conception that people have, which is the idea that they would know by looking at me or my sense of humor or what I like in esports, what I would like outside of esports. That's such a bizarre premise to me. I mean, I would go ahead and say, if I picked up my most interesting friends in esports, you would have no clue what music or movies these people like, unless they've already spoken about it. Like, that's what makes them interesting people, is they are unique. They have their own standards. They have their own ways of thinking. They have their own predilections. They have their own guilty pleasures. And so you would be shocked, and you would be impressed, and you would be disappointed, and you'd be underwhelmed by some of the choices that they would enjoy. So I'm amazed that people would think, it's shocking that he would like battle rap. What, where people talk shit all the time, say really clever things off the cuff, and have prepared material that they're expected to execute in a live stage format. Isn't that literally what I do for my job? Seems like the interests align pretty on the nose there, right? I would say in terms of other interests, there's plenty. I'm not going to go into all of them now. I'm a pretty private person, but I would say, for example, I don't think most people, except if they've heard me say it, would know I have an interest in Hermeticism, Gnosticism, mythology. I mean, I have a very, very wide taste in terms of books, music, comic books, goes across the board in those respects. Plenty of things. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is another one I've always been fascinated by. Definitely lots of I won't say religion in as much as I like kind of the philosophy or the mythology behind the religions. I think those are very, very interesting. So I think there's plenty of things in that respect. Jerky's Minion, my old boy, says, if we could bring back one particular player from 1.6 and have him, in theory, transition over to CSGO perfectly, who would you bring back? Now, I'll put it in the description box here, but there's actually an article I did along those lines. I think it was in like 2015 or something, 2014. Probably 2014, I would imagine. Yeah, it must be 2014 because it was for On Gamers. And so now it will be hosted on GameSpot. It'll be in the description box. And it was exactly this concept. It was 10 Counter-Strike 1.6 pros who would have been good in CSGO. Now, funnily enough, one of them actually already did come over, which is, I had Savage, the Chinese player, listed. He did come over. I had him like number 4 or something, I think. He didn't end up being as sick as I thought he would, but that's the problem with CSGO. It's such a different game. So I generally picked people either based on their skill set, like they weren't just based around spray only, or on the basis that they had an aggressive playing style, because I think CSGO favours that a lot more, and it's a lot more about the trade game overall. So personally, I would just go ahead and I'll pick the top 2 people on my list, because I still think they would be amazing CSGO players. So one of them is Gux, the very good Swedish player who played for SK Gaming and for Fnatic, and who at one point in time was on Lions as well. I think he would be an exceptional player. I would put him as a kind of I would say he would maybe be like a Nico type player. Like, he has an aggressive side to him, really nice skill set. Doesn't have as good skills as Nico, a little bit more based around spamming and spraying a little bit, not as crisp on the bursts. Game sense not quite as good, but still pretty good. Was a good player in clutches, a very confident player, guy who wants to play aggressively and play, making have the team play around him. And crucially, thought he was as good as people like Forrest and Get Right. That's one of the things I always respected about him. A lot of other players like put themselves behind those guys. So he would be a good one. And then the other one is actually the Finnish player Ruit. He was my number 1 player on this. Very aggressive player, very skilled player who just has skill with all the weapons. His mentality is just to play to his limits at all times. He has no fear whatsoever because he really believes he's better than whoever he plays and could take over an entire game. I think he would be an incredible CSGO player. So the article's in the description box. Jake C. Bishop says, if you were given complete control of Navi, what changes would you make to establish an era? Right, the problem is I actually do think Zeus is a good in-game leader generally, but I also have heard things behind the scenes that he didn't put in the hours, or that he's just kind of like mailing it in at times. That kills me. So if I'm going to keep him, then I want some good player to play in his elsewhere for Edward. So that would probably mean I personally would have liked to have seen Adren go to Navi. I think with the comms, he could bring... That's the problem. That's why an Adren in FaZe wasn't as good, in my opinion, is that Adren is a cerebral player. So I want his comms. I want his secondary calls. I feel like he could help Zeus in that respect. I even think they sync up a little bit in terms of mentality, which is why in Gambit they worked so well. So I think that would be a good one right there. I think it's also a veteran that they all respect. Hobbit one wouldn't have been bad, but I think you'd have to craft him a little bit more. But then again, I've never seen Hobbit play as well as he did under Zeus. So I think Zeus could definitely do something with him in that respect. I also wouldn't be bad with just stripping Navi down. Let's just strip it down to simple and electronic. Maybe Zeus, we'll see. And then let's throw in, let me think, who else would I like to see in that team? You could maybe try someone like Quicker. You could try like Sumdai Young, I think's that guy. I mean, this is to make like a beast team, because I think in their team, Zeus likes the slower style of play, but he also, when he panics, does all those fast hits. So I feel like actually you could go towards that style of play. It would probably be pretty effective right now in Counter-Strike. If anything, maybe Furia is showing you some of that. So I think you could definitely go a superstar, a FaZe-esque role if you want to be in Navi. I think that would be a pretty good approach as well. I think basically everyone's on the chopping block except Simple and Electronic. So many different angles we can go with there. Let me think, what else could we do? I think another angle would be to go super tactical. So if you put someone like Blade in, and then you only have Simple as the free range element, he's the device in that concept, and the rest of them play through a tactic, I think that could work, although Blade's fragging has been terrible. Then again, if you've got Simple Electronic, do you need him to frag that? Well, probably not, right? It's probably more on people like Flamey not contributing. Right, Thomas Bushell says, people often ask you to build the perfect CS team, but I've always wanted to know about your thoughts on LOL. I know there would be many factors in your perfect league roster in general, so let's just say you are building a roster to take down G2 in LEC and to do well internationally this year. Who do you pick for your team? Right, so assuming I can't make a miracle scenario happen, like Forgiven comes back and he's super motivated, I'm going to build a sick team around him, I'll pick from current active players in LEC. I'm not going to take imports from Korea, off Mene or whatever, even though I certainly think there's a world you could do that with the Dardox of the world, but let's just say we're only going to pick LEC players here, and I'm going to try and pick a team that not only has good players at every role, but I think would have a decent spread of like knowledge base for shot calling. I think would have personalities that would work together and would have the right balance of carry threats, etc. So I think I've got a pretty good lineup here. I'm going to go Kabashard top lane, and that's the clear one for me right now. He can play both styles of top lane. He's been on a team that's very aggressive early. I think he could definitely be a great player in most other styles of team. Seems to have a very nice self-sufficient mentality. I'll take him as my top laner. I'll put him with Selfmade, because I tell you what, if I have Selfmade as my jungler and Kabashard as my top laner, I can dominate a lot of games through top lane, and they have the picks to do it. I think Selfmade is one of the revelations of European League of Legends. He reminds me of when Jankos first came in with Roccat, and I saw this guy and I was like, that's the guy on that team. That's the guy who's going to endure and be something special and can be the next Diamond Prox. Selfmade, I see him in the same lineage. Not Broxer, not some of the past players that we've had at jungle, not Cold. I think Selfmade's the dude, and he can be something very, very special. So if I have strong solo lanes, this guy going to be a monster, and he can carry games himself. So I think, yeah, he's only had one split, but very, very impressive for me so far. Big, big potential. I'm going to have NateDOhDoubleG as my mid laner. Not that he's necessarily the best mid laner after Caps. Like, first of all, I'd love to have Perks, but he's on G2. I think if you look elsewhere in the league, Jizuke has at times been very good, but he's also played a very gimmicky style. Hasn't played all the types that of mid lane that you can play in League of Legends in that respect. So I think overall, NateDOhDoubleG's just a very, very stable pick. He'll always be an above average mid laner, probably usually be an elite mid laner in EU. He's a guy who always is motivated to practice, will always have a wide champion pool, will always pick intelligently for himself in matches. Yeah, probably still sometimes prioritizes comfort in playing style a little bit too much, and has been on teams more recently that had a nice spread of players across the board, so I can sort of see why he got away with that. But I also think in this team, again, he's a guy you don't have to play all the time through, but you can, and he can be a very good player. So I'll take NateDOhDoubleG there. I don't think he'll ever be a bad player. AD carry and support are the one I have the most options for. Like, I'd love the potential of someone like Patrick. I think he could be a very good player one day. The question is, who am I going to pair him with? Like, as an individual bot lane, I'm not as convinced with the Mithy and Patrick pairing. I think Upset's an obvious guy with a very, very high peak, but I still think he's missing a little something in terms of, like, He's got the skill set to be a Forgiven or a Doublelift, but I don't always know if he has the mentality to like how to demand that aspect to his role, how to forgive other players on his team for not being as good, how to not have that bullshit angle of like, well, I had a good game, did you guys? Like, no, that's the point. They give you the resources, you carry the game. That's what being the best player is about. Does he have that mentality for that? I think his youth and his inexperience has meant he hasn't had to, and he's been in teams with players at the moment that have been more experienced, and he's given that up. But if he develops that, then he would be my pick for this one, because I think over of these people that I'm picking, the three here, he could be the best, excluding Forgiven, who hasn't come back. Then, I tell you what, a very nice stable pick on the same lines I said about NateDOhDoubleG is Reckless. Like, Reckless is always going to give you that same playing style. He's always going to be good in team fights. He's always going to be decent in lane. He's always going to have an alright champion pool. He's going to have his comfort picks that he's going to be strong on. And if you get his comfort picks to be meta, then he's going to be a very strong AD carry. So, I think Reckless is definitely a good one. He's got more experience than the others. He's played with more teammates than the others. Yes, he needs a good top and mid, in my opinion, to succeed. But he's got it in this team. So, why not have Reckless, right? I think Reckless is probably the most safest pick of them all there. But Patrick's also a nice pick. Finally, for support player, it's either Hylissang or Mithy. Mithy, great because he's got the shot calling element. He's a great mind for the team. He can actually teach people things about the game. I think that's a very, very big angle. Hylissang has some shot calling components as well, depending on who I'm picking as my ADC. I might do it like, you know what, I actually think I would prefer to put like Mithy with Reckless and then Patrick with Hylissang. And those are better pairings in terms of what would suit them. I think Patrick would be a monster laner in that scenario. I think Reckless doesn't want to lane that much anyway, so why even bother? I want to put him with Mithy, have him help call around the mid game, and then let's just dominate late and with great calls for the fights and great team fighting from Reckless. So I think I could go for either one of those. And the problem is at the moment, Mithy individually makes a lot of mistakes. Hylissang's a better player individually. Then again, Hylissang isn't, I think, as good a leadership figure, shot caller overall as Mithy. And so what I like about this team is we've got a lot of self-sufficient players. We've got a lot of players who don't mind you playing through the other lane, but players who can be the best at their position. We've got support and jungler who, again, are very self-directed, who are willing to give comms to the others, who are willing to have others follow their lead. And we've got players who will follow their lead. So I think this is a monster lineup. Like, I think this lineup already could potentially beat G2. I think probably are over it in G2. I think there's some unbeatable team. I think in this meta, this lineup would do great. Right, a few more. Matrim says, would you consider the 2018 World Finalist Fnatic roster to be a better team than the 2015 Huni and Reignover version of the roster? How would you compare the two? Right, the problem with the 2018 one is it played a totally different meta against a totally different set of opponents from China and Korea, and that's the problem. I think if you go back and you look at the teams that 2015 Huni and Reignover Fnatic played against, first of all, even though they didn't end up being good, the Chinese teams were very scary. LGD, EDG coming into that tournament, they were potential champions. You look elsewhere, you obviously had Katie Roster looked pretty sweet coming in that year. Obviously, Ku Tigers always had solid strength, and SKT, that might have been their best team ever. So I think that was incredibly hard line. Like, I don't think 2018, if you could fly them back in time and they all played that meta, I don't think they would make the final on that one. If they would, don't think they would win the tournament. So if you took Huni and Reignover's lineup and took it to the modern day, now, first of all, it'd actually be pretty good in this meta, I have to say. And then secondly, would it have done better though? I think it'd probably do a similar kind of performance. I don't think there's that much overall between them. Like, I do think 2018 is better in terms of the fact I think it has true carry threats out of all the lanes, even though Reckless generally isn't going to do that overall, but he can, certainly. It's just a mindset thing with him. I do think 2015 was based a little bit too much around playing through Huni. It's just that worked, and there weren't many players who could do what he could in that meta. People like Smeb were some of the only ones, actually, and Marin, etc. So I think in that regard, it was pretty good overall. Let me think. How would I compare the two? See, I feel as though the 2015 team was a little bit more limited in how it played, but executed a lot better, and everyone understood their role better. 2018, I think, had a lot more potential. I think actually had more potential than it even showed. Could play in many, many different ways in theory, and through many different players. Had some more dynamic players in that regard, but as a result could also fuck up, could get drawn into scrappy games, could play bizarrely thanks to people like Bwipo and Caps, making sometimes bizarre errors overall. So I have to say, I kind of feel like it's a bit of a push between the two. Like, I don't think it's clear that one is better than the other. I probably think the last one might be the best lineup ever from Europe. G2's new lineup can probably match it in that regard. But I certainly think the 2015 lineup was a very, very good lineup as well. And I'd love to see them reversed and play in a different meta in a different time period, because maybe the 2015 one in the modern day, maybe it would have had a chance to win the tournament, right? Certainly interested in that respect. We'll ask a couple more here, but can't do too many. So the other ones I'll bounce into my next one, which will also come this month. So we'll do one more question. Daniel Andreas says, you get to ask one question to a player after a really intense match they won. What would you ask them that really bring out the mind behind the match, and why would you ask that? So this is something I have actually thought about, because obviously that famous topic of like a lot of the female interviewers, but interviews in general, ladies sports, always asking that question, like, how do you feel? To some of us, we're like, I don't really care how it feels. Like, there can't be an interesting answer to that question usually. But I would say that a good comment, I kind of spitballed this with Yiska, the guy I do some Overwatch content with, was a great question would be to ask them, what did it take to win? It's a very open-ended question, but at the same time, it has an element of it that's pointed. It's going to force them to really dig in, to reflect on the game, to think about how the game went, about some key moments, and that's a good one. I think another one would be to say something like, how did you do it? Why did you win? What is it about you that let you win this game? I think these are all pretty good questions. They have lots of revealing aspects to it. I think you could even ask, if you want to get cheeky, you could even say something like, should you have won that game? If it was a really close, intense game, let's see how they come out with it. Maybe they have a great justification for a move they made. Maybe they say, hey, actually, you know what, it was close to this point in time. Could have gone their way as well. Like, maybe you get, problem is that one has a little bit more option for a political answer there. But you can see, generally, you want to give them the freedom to answer, but make it the quadrant that you want it within, and then give them a little bit of wiggle room so they can come up with something interesting. Anyway, there'll be another one of these this month, so check it out. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Butt Pounder 420, Andreas, Snazore Westerlund, Wendelful, Chi Mao, JDubs, Alexander Rao, Blunt Smoking Anus Destroyer, Daniel Olivar, NateDOhDoubleG, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, and a special thanks go out to Jerky's Minion and weixz. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you'd like to ask me a question in my monthly AMA. Do you want teasers for my upcoming content? See who the guests are. Maybe you'd like to take part in a donator discussion with me on video. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at link in the description box below.